Okay, so once we leave the stomach, we enter into the small intestine, and there are three regions of the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So we just go into each one of those in order. So the stomach would be hooked up here. And so now we're going to the duodenum, which is first. The duodenum is where most of the chemical digestion of food takes place. So this is where like a lot of activity goes into breaking down proteins, breaking down carbohydrates, and emulsifying and breaking down lipids. So breaking down those nutrients into their smaller like monomers, their smaller forms, so that they can be absorbed into the bloodstream. And the absorption mostly occurs in the next section, the jejunum. So here we see the duodenum, then we see the jejunum. So that's where a lot of absorption takes place. That's where we're absorbing nutrients into the bloodstream. And then finally the ileum, where we have absorption of micronutrients like some vitamins such as B12. Duodenum, most of the chemical digestion. Jejunum, most of the absorption of your macronutrients, which are proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. But remember that they're not being absorbed in their large polymer form. They're being broken down into their monomer form, in their smaller form, so that they can be absorbed easily into the bloodstream. And then ileum is more about absorption of micronutrients, such as vitamins. Okay. And then one other thing we want to point out about the small intestine is that the lining, the inside of that tube, has these structures called villi. And we saw these before when we talked about the lacteals in the lymphatic system. So here's your lacteal, if you remember, in your villi. And so the lining of the small intestine has all of these finger-like villi to increase the surface area for absorption. So it just, instead of having a flat surface, it creates all these access points for those broken down nutrients to cross those cells and get into the bloodstream, which you see here represented by the capillaries, red and blue. So the villi increase surface area for absorption, and they are finger-like projections. Okay. So now we need to talk about the accessory organs that are related to the small intestine. So the liver, first we need to talk about a fluid. There's a fluid called bile. It's a liquid or fluid that emulsifies fats. So the way fats are, they're like a big blob like this, and it's hard for the enzymes. So there's enzymes called lipases, and they want to break down this fat into smaller components. But when you have a big fat blob like this, it's hard for the enzymes to get at that fat blob to start to break it down. So what bile does, bile comes in, and bile is a fluid, and it just kind of gets in between here. So it's called emulsifying. It's not actually breaking down this fat blob, but it's getting in there and separating some sections of the fat blob from others. So like this little section would then move away, and this little section would move away, and this little section would move away. You get the idea? And like this little section would move away. And then that way it'll be easier for those enzymes to work on those pieces of the fat blob, because it's going to have more access points now around that little blob rather than the big blob. So that's what emulsifying is. It's breaking down it. So you don't want to say breaking down, because usually when we think of breaking down, that's taking like a macromolecule like a triglyceride and breaking it down into its components, which would be glycerols and fatty acids. But it's emulsifying. It's taking a blob of fat and separating it into smaller chunks of fat. Okay, and then, so that's our fluid that does the emulsifying, bile. But then who makes bile? So the liver. The liver makes the bile, it actually produces it, and then the gallbladder stores it. So if you ever want to see your gallbladder on ultrasound, make sure not to eat a fatty meal before you go get your ultrasound, because if you eat a fatty meal, the body will sense that and it will eject the bile from the gallbladder and it'll go into the duodenum, and then you won't be able to see your gallbladder. But if you want to see your gallbladder, don't eat fat, because there'll be a bunch of bile stored in your gallbladder, and then that'll make it really show up on the ultrasound, and you can see it well. So yeah, liver makes the bile, gallbladder stores it. So then when you eat a fatty meal, it's going to be released from the gallbladder into the duodenum. So specifically, in order to get that bile into the digestive system to work on those lipids, the liver and gallbladder send that bile through this duct right here called the common bile duct, and that's how the bile gets into the duodenum. Okay, so bile enters the duodenum via the common bile duct. Okay. So yeah, here we see that bile is going into the duodenum specifically, not the jejunum, not the ileum, but specifically into the duodenum. Then we need to talk about the pancreas. So you remember that we also saw the pancreas in the endocrine system, right? Because it made insulin and glucagon, which were hormones that regulated glucose levels of the blood. But the pancreas is also involved with the digestive system. So it makes and secretes something called pancreatic juice. And pancreatic juice contains 3 types of enzymes, which are proteases. Remember, ASE is enzymes. Proteases, amylases, and lipases. Okay? And these 3 types of enzymes break down the macromolecule that it says. So proteases break down proteins, amylases break down carbohydrates, and lipases break down lipids. Carbohydrates are sugars, lipids are fats. And so all of those in that pancreatic juice, so here's the pancreas, this yellow organ right here. And so all that pancreatic juice comes in through this pancreatic duct and it's released into the duodenum as well. Because remember we said the duodenum is where most of the chemical digestion takes place. So we need to release those digestive enzymes into the duodenum so that chemical digestion can take place. In addition to the enzymes, the pancreatic juice also contains this guy, bicarbonate ion, and bicarbonate ion is important to neutralize the stomach acid. So remember that as we come out of the stomach, we are chyme, right? And that's a mixture of food and acid. So that has a really, really low pH. It's very acidic. So as it comes into the duodenum, we need to neutralize that acid so we don't destroy the wall of the duodenum. So we have, as part of our pancreatic juice, we have bicarbonate ion that's being released into the duodenum to help neutralize that acidic chyme. Yep, and so then the pancreas, it specifically sends its pancreatic juice containing those enzymes and the bicarbonate ion into the duodenum. Okay, so after the small intestine, we get into the large intestine. And so because, again, this is the advanced class, we're going to learn the 5 specific regions of the large intestine. So the first one is the cecum, which is right here. It's this pouch at the beginning of the large intestine. Then ascending, if you ascend something, it means you go up. So then we move to the ascending colon. Colon is another word for large intestine, by the way. Then they've cut it off here, but between this section would be the transverse colon. Then coming down, descending means to go down. If you go down a mountain, you descend. So we go to the descending colon. And then finally, at the end, we go to the sigmoid colon because it's a little bit S-shaped. So what happens in the large intestine? What happens in the colon? So at this point, basically all the nutrients that the small intestine wanted have been taken out, and whatever material is left over moves into the large intestine. The large intestine performs the final modifications to make feces. And feces is poop. So the main thing that the large intestine does is that it absorbs excess water from that remaining material. So if you think about diarrhea is really watery, right? So that means the body sent something in what you ate that it was like, oh, we need to get this out of here and we need to move this through quick. So that material moves through the large intestine so quickly that it doesn't have enough time to get the water out of it. So instead of having solid fecal matter, you end up with watery fecal matter. And then the large intestine also contains bacteria that produce vitamins. So those are some of your beneficial bacteria that you hear a lot about in terms of colon health. Yes, so large intestine absorbs water, makes feces, and there's bacteria in there that make some vitamins. And then finally, we get to the very end where we're in the rectum. So in the rectum is where feces is temporarily stored. So for a little while it's stored, and that's the area that gives you the urge that you need to go. And then the anus is literally the very last opening at the end. It has an internal sphincter that we're not in control of, and an external sphincter, which we are in control of. And so that's the final exit point of the digestive system. So thank you for your time.